Racist teacher dumps paint on black girl's dress. Not knowing her mom is watching a young girl's dress becomes a target, but her mother is prepared to make this moment a turning point. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The brick facade of Lincoln Elementary School stood proud against the autumn sky, its reputation as a safe haven for learning carefully maintained through years of selective storytelling. Children's laughter echoed across the playground, their small bodies darting between swing sets and slides during the mid-morning recess. Among them, 8-year-old Chloe Thompson stood out, not just because of her infectious smile, but because of the vibrant dress she wore, a handmade creation her grandmother had sewn for her birthday, featuring prints of African flowers in bold yellows and purples against a deep blue background. Miss Jenkins watched from her usual spot near the art room window, her thin lips pressed into a tight line. Her gaze followed Chloe as the young girl twirled, showing off her dress to a group of admiring classmates. The art teacher's fingers drummed against the windowsill, her knuckles white from gripping the edge too hard. 23 years of teaching had earned Miss Jenkins a reputation for strictness, but lately, her colleagues had noticed a sharper edge to her comments, particularly when discussing certain students. The bell rang, and the children filed into the art classroom. Chloe settled into her usual spot near the front, carefully spreading her dress beneath her as she sat. Miss Jenkins began the lesson on color theory, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness she'd perfected over the years. The assignment was simple: create a color wheel using primary colors to mix secondary and tertiary shades. As the children worked, the classroom filled with the usual chaos of an elementary art class: spilled water cups, paint-smeared hands, and excited chatter. Miss Jenkins moved between the tables, offering curt corrections and occasional praise. When she reached Chloe's table, she paused. The girl had created not just a color wheel, but had begun incorporating the colors into a pattern similar to the one on her dress. "This isn't what I assigned," Miss Jenkins said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. The instructions were clear. Chloe's smile faltered. "I finished the color wheel first, Miss Jenkins." "I thought, that's the problem." Miss Jenkins cut her off, reaching for the paper. "You didn't think about following instructions." Her hand knocked against the water cup on Chloe's desk, but instead of steadying it, her fingers seemed to guide its fall. Red paint splashed across Chloe's dress, spreading across the fabric like a wound. The classroom fell silent. Chloe looked down at her grandmother's handiwork, now stained with angry red splotches. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at Miss Jenkins, who stood over her with an expression that flickered between feigned concern and poorly concealed satisfaction. "Accidents happen when we don't follow instructions," Miss Jenkins said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Chloe's first sob broke the silence, followed by another and another. From down the hall, where Angela Thompson had been waiting to meet with another teacher about volunteering for the upcoming fall festival, the sound of her daughter's distress cut through the walls like a knife. She moved without thinking, her heels clicking against the linoleum as she rushed toward the art room. By the time Angela reached the doorway, the scene had already burned itself into her memory. Her daughter, hunched over in her chair, red paint dripping from her beloved dress. Miss Jenkins standing over her, a paper towel held uselessly in one hand and a smile, small but unmistakable, playing at the corners of her mouth. And 24 other children, frozen in their seats, witnesses to a moment that would set in motion events none of them could have predicted. Angela's hand gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white with tension. The sound of her daughter's tears mixed with Miss Jenkins's light, dismissive laughter, creating a discord that would echo through the halls of Lincoln Elementary long after this moment passed. In that frozen second, as paint dripped and tears fell, the carefully maintained facade of safety and equality at Lincoln Elementary began to crack, revealing the ugly truth that had lurked beneath its surface all along. Angela's instinct to rush into the art room warred with a darker impulse: the need to hear what would be said when people thought no one was listening. She stepped back from the doorway, her body pressed against the wall next to the teacher's lounge. Through the thin walls, voices carried with painful clarity. "They always make such a fuss. Miss Jenkins's voice drifted through, accompanied by the sound of a coffee cup being set down too hard. It's just paint. The dress was inappropriate for art class anyway. Too loud. Angela's fingernails dug into her palms as she listened. Other teachers murmured in response, not agreeing, perhaps, but not objecting either. Their silence felt like sandpaper against her skin. Through the wall, she could hear the scraping of chairs, the rustle of papers, the ordinary sounds of a school day continuing as if nothing had happened. Someone should talk to the mother about appropriate school attire, Miss Jenkins continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that masked something uglier. These children need to learn to blend in. It's for their own good, really. More murmurs, more shuffling papers. Angela counted her breaths, trying to steady herself. She had encountered racism before, the subtle kind that came wrapped in polite smiles and careful words. But this was different. This was aimed at her child, and it had left visible marks. The drive home was silent. Chloe sat in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, careful not to touch the stained dress. Angela watched her daughter in the rearview mirror, noting how she made herself smaller, how she turned toward the window as if trying to disappear. Their house felt too quiet when they walked in. Angela helped Chloe change out of the dress, her hands gentle as she folded the ruined fabric. She would try to save it later, but right now, her daughter needed her more than the dress needed cleaning. "I don't want to go back," Chloe whispered, sitting on her bed in fresh clothes. Her voice, usually so full of life, sounded hollow. "Can't I go to a different school?" Angela sat beside her daughter, pulling her close. "No, baby, we're not going anywhere." She felt Chloe stiffen, probably expecting the usual speech about being strong, about not letting them win. Instead, Angela said, "We're going to fix this." The parent-teacher meeting notice sat on the kitchen counter, scheduled for that evening. Angela stared at it while making dinner, her mind racing through scenarios. She had attended these meetings before, sat quietly, nodded politely, played the role of the cooperative parent. It had kept the peace, but at what cost? As she stirred the pasta, Angela thought about all the times she'd chosen peace over justice. The job interviews where she'd smiled through microaggressions, the neighborhood meetings where she'd swallowed her responses to coded language, the school events where she pretended not to notice the way some parents pulled their children away from Chloe. The meeting would start in 2 hours. Miss Jenkins would be there, along with other teachers and parents. Angela imagined walking into that room, taking her usual seat against the wall, staying quiet as they discussed fundraisers and field trips as if nothing had happened. Her hand shook as he turned off the stove. From the living room, she could hear Chloe practicing her reading, her voice still subdued but present. The sound steeled Angela's resolve even as fear crept up her spine. The truth was, she didn't know how to fight this battle. She had no strategy, no allies, no guarantee that speaking up wouldn't make things worse. But the image of her daughter shrinking in that art room, of paint spreading across her grandmother's handiwork, of Miss Jenkins's satisfied smile, it all burned in her memory, demanding action. Angela checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, straightening her blazer. The woman who stared back looked professional, composed, exactly the kind of parent the school was comfortable with. But beneath that careful exterior, something was shifting. The same hands that had gently folded a ruined dress now clenched with purpose. The same voice that had always chosen diplomatic silence now rehearsed words of confrontation. As she grabbed her keys, Angela paused at Chloe's doorway. Her daughter had fallen asleep, surrounded by books, her shield against the day's pain. Angela watched her chest rise and fall, thinking about the world that had taught her child to make herself smaller, to expect less, to accept injustice as normal. "Not anymore," Angela whispered, more to herself than to her sleeping child. "Not in this school. Not to my daughter." The drive to the school felt longer than usual, each mile marking the distance between who she had been this morning and who she needed to become. The parking lot was already half full when she arrived. Through the school windows, she could see Miss Jenkins setting up for the meeting, still wearing that same self-satisfied expression. Angela's hand rested on the car door handle, her heart pounding. She had chosen peace so many times before. Tonight, she would choose justice. If only she could find the courage to open the door. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the school library as parents filed in, taking their usual seats among the metal folding chairs. Angela chose a spot in the middle row, not hiding in the back, but not confrontationally close to the front either. Her hands remained steady as she placed her notepad on her lap, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Principal Matthews began the meeting with the usual updates about fundraising goals and upcoming events. Parents nodded along, some taking notes, others checking their phones. Miss Jenkins sat near the front, her posture perfect, occasionally adding comments about the importance of maintaining standards in the art program. When the principal opened the floor for parent concerns, Angela's hand rose before her brain could second-guess the decision. The room shifted its attention to her, and she felt the weight of dozens of eyes. She stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling fingers. "This morning," she began, her voice stronger than she expected, "my daughter's dress was ruined in art class. But this isn't about a ruined dress. This is about a pattern of behavior that's been ignored for too long." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Miss Jenkins's spine stiffened, but Angela continued, recounting the morning's events in detail. The deliberate spill, the mocking laughter, the dismissive response. As she spoke, she noticed subtle changes in the room. Parents shifting uncomfortably, exchanging glances, some nodding in recognition. "My daughter came home today, believing she needed to change who she is to be accepted in this school," Angela said, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "She wanted to transfer, but running away won't fix what's broken here." From 2 rows back, a woman stood up. Maria Rodriguez. Angela recognized her from school pickup. "My son came home last month, saying Miss Jenkins told him to stop speaking Spanish in class because it was disruptive," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "I didn't say anything because I thought maybe I was being too sensitive." The dam broke. More parents began speaking up. Small incidents they dismissed, comments they tried to forget, moments when their children had come home different than when they'd left. Miss Jenkins's face grew increasingly pale as the stories mounted. Principal Matthews attempted to regain control of the meeting. "These are serious allegations that we'll need to investigate properly. Perhaps we should move on to other matters for now." "No," Angela interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "We've been moving on for years. That's why we're here now." She turned to face Miss Jenkins directly. "You thought no one was watching. You thought we wouldn't speak up. But we see you. We've always seen you. And we're not staying quiet anymore." Miss Jenkins stood, her composure cracking. "These accusations are ridiculous. I have 23 years of experience. I've never had a complaint, because fear isn't the same as respect," Maria interjected, moving to stand beside Angela. "Because silence isn't the same as acceptance." The meeting ended in chaos, with Principal Matthews promising a full investigation while trying to hustle everyone out of the library. But something had changed. Parents clustered in small groups, exchanging phone numbers and stories. Angela found herself at the center of a growing circle of mothers and fathers who had been waiting for anyone, to say what they'd all been thinking. Maria touched Angela's arm as they walked to their cars. "I've been wanting to speak up for months," she admitted, "but I was afraid of making trouble. My family, we've learned to keep our heads down, you know." Angela nodded, recognizing the familiar calculation, the constant weighing of injustice against safety, of dignity against survival. "I understand," she said, "but maybe that's what they count on. Maybe keeping our heads down is what lets them keep pushing us down." They exchanged numbers, promising to meet for coffee. As other parents passed by, many stopped to express support or share their own stories. The parking lot became an impromptu community meeting, voices rising and falling in the cool evening air. Principal Matthews watched from the school entrance, her expression unreadable. Miss Jenkins had already left, slipping out a side door while the parents were still talking. The investigation she'd promised felt like a hollow gesture, a bureaucratic response to a human problem. But as Angela drove home, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Not the naive hope of quick solutions, but the stronger hope that comes from finding allies in what you thought was a solitary fight. The school's facade of inclusivity had cracked. revealing both the rot beneath and the possibility of real change. Chloe was still awake when she got home, sitting up in bed with a book. "How was the meeting?" she asked, her voice small but curious. Angela sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her daughter close. "It was a beginning," she said, kissing the top of Chloe's head. "Just a beginning." The community center's meeting room wasn't large, but by 7 o'clock that evening, it was packed. Angela had reserved it for 2 hours, expecting maybe a handful of parents. Instead, she found herself arranging extra chairs as families continued to arrive, their voices creating a low hum of multiple languages mixing in the air. Maria had helped spread the word through her network of Latino parents. James Chun, whose daughter was in Chloe's class, had reached out to the Asian American families. What started as a conversation in a parking lot had grown into something larger, something with momentum. "I never knew how many of us had stories," James said, helping Angela set up a refreshment table. His normally quiet demeanor had given way to an urgent energy. "My Anna came home last month crying because Miss Jenkins said her art was too oriental and made her start over. I told her to just do what the teacher wanted. I've been ashamed of that advice ever since." The room settled as Angela stood at the front, her prepared notes suddenly seeming inadequate for the crowd before her. She saw determination in their faces, but also fear, the kind that comes from years of choosing silence over conflict, safety over justice. "We're not here to complain," she began, her voice steady. "We're here to create change. Real, lasting change that will protect not just our children, but every child who walks through those school doors." Parents began sharing their stories, each one adding to a pattern that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents. A Muslim mother described how her son's geometric art was repeatedly criticized for being too foreign. A Black father talked about his daughter being seated at the back of the class despite her vision problems. Then James stood up, clutching a folder. "I have a proposal," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "My wife teaches art at the community college. She suggested we organize an art exhibition. Not just any exhibition, but one that celebrates our children's heritage, their experiences, their true creativity." The room buzzed with energy as parents built on the idea. Maria suggested incorporating traditional crafts from different cultures. A Jamaican mother offered to coordinate with local artists who could mentor the children. The exhibition began to take shape, not just as a protest, but as an affirmation. Chloe, who had been quietly drawing in the corner, approached the front of the room with a piece of paper. On it, she had drawn herself in her ruined dress, but instead of paint stains, she had transformed the red splotches into blooming flowers. "Can I show this?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "Can I show how it felt, but also how I want it to be?" The room fell silent. Angela felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked at her daughter's drawing. The pain of the experience transformed into something beautiful, something defiant. This was more than an art show now. This was a declaration. More children who had come with their parents began sharing their own ideas. Their voices, usually subdued in Miss Jenkins's classroom, grew animated as they described what they wanted to create. Parents watched with a mixture of pride and pain, seeing their children emerge from shells they hadn't even realized had formed. "We'll need space," Angela said, beginning to list logistics on a whiteboard. "And supplies. And time to organize everything. I can donate materials from my store," offered Mr. Patel, who owned an art supply shop downtown. "And my wife is on the local arts council. She can help us make this official." James pulled up the school district's policy handbook on his tablet. "According to this, we have the right to use school facilities for community events if we follow proper procedures. They can't legally stop us." The meeting ran well over its scheduled time, but no one seemed to notice. By the end, they had committees formed, tasks assigned, and a timeline established. More importantly, they had a shared purpose that transcended their individual grievances. As parents packed up, exchanging numbers and making plans for future meetings, Angela watched Chloe showing her drawing to other children. They gathered around her, adding their own ideas, their laughter echoing in the room. Maria touched Angela's shoulder. "You know Miss Jenkins won't like this," she said softly. "She'll try to stop it." "Let her try," Angela replied, watching the children draw together. "Some things are worth fighting for." The community center janitor had to remind them twice that it was time to close. As they filtered out into the parking lot, the energy remained high. Parents who had entered as strangers left as allies, their shared purpose lighting the way forward. Driving home, Angela glanced at Chloe in the rearview mirror. Her daughter was still chattering about ideas for her artwork, her earlier fear replaced by excitement. The ruined dress hung in their closet at home, but its story was transforming into something powerful, a catalyst for change rather than a symbol of shame. "Mom," Chloe said suddenly, "do you think we can really do this?" Angela thought about the room full of parents and children, each carrying their own stories of silence and submission, each now ready to speak through art and action. "Yes," she answered, believing it fully for the first time. "Together, we can do this." The weeks leading up to the exhibition transformed Lincoln Elementary's atmosphere. During art classes, Miss Jenkins noticed her students' changing behavior. They were less afraid, more expressive. They worked on their approved projects with minimal enthusiasm, saving their real creativity for after school, where parents had set up an impromptu art studio in the cafeteria. Miss Jenkins stood at her classroom window, watching children rush past her room toward the cafeteria. Her complaints to Principal Matthews about unauthorized use of school facilities had been met with carefully worded responses about community engagement policies. "This is undermining everything we've built," Miss Jenkins argued during an emergency staff meeting she called. "These children need structure, not this free-for-all expression." Some teachers nodded along, comfortable in their routines. Others shifted uncomfortably, seeing the energy and joy the after-school sessions had brought to their students. The divide among staff grew more pronounced each day. In the cafeteria, Angela and the other parents had created something remarkable. Tables were arranged by activity: painting, sculpture, textile art, digital photography. Local artists from different cultural backgrounds moved between groups, offering guidance and encouragement. Chloe had become a different person in this space. She worked on a series of paintings that told her story: the dress, the paint, the shame, and finally the pride. Other children gathered around her work, adding their own experiences, creating a collective narrative of resistance and resilience. "They're going to try to shut us down," Maria warned one afternoon, showing Angela an email from the school board questioning the liability insurance for their activities. "They're looking for any excuse." Angela had anticipated this. Mr. Patel's wife had already secured proper insurance through the Arts Council. James's wife had documented every session, building a portfolio that showed the educational value of their program. They had followed every rule, filed every form, left no room for technical objections. But Miss Jenkins found other ways to push back. She began assigning excessive homework to art students, scheduling mandatory after-school sessions that conflicted with the exhibition preparation. Parents reported their children being criticized more harshly in class, their grades suddenly dropping without clear explanation. "She's trying to break our spirit," James said during an emergency parent meeting. "Make us choose between our children's grades and our dignity." The pressure mounted as the exhibition date approached. Miss Jenkins submitted a formal complaint to the school board, claiming the after-school program promoted divisiveness and undermined academic standards. She gathered signatures from like-minded parents who worried about maintaining traditional values. Angela found Chloe crying one evening after class. "Miss Jenkins said my painting about the dress incident is inappropriately personal and might make other students uncomfortable," she sobbed. "She said I should paint something nice like flowers or trees." The rage Angela felt in that moment was cold and clarifying. She'd played by the rules, followed proper channels, maintained professional courtesy. But watching her daughter struggle with censorship of her truth sparked something fiercer. That night, she called an emergency meeting of their core group. Parents gathered in her living room, tired but determined. On her coffee table lay Miss Jenkins's complaint, forwarded by a sympathetic school board member. "She's right about one thing," Angela said, addressing the worried faces around her. "This is personal. It's personal for every child who's been told their culture is too foreign, their voice too loud, their truth too uncomfortable." Maria stood up, her voice firm. "Then we make it more personal. We invite the local press to the exhibition. We show everyone what our children have been creating and why. The school board won't like the publicity, James warned. Good, Angela replied. Maybe it's time they felt uncomfortable for a change. They worked late into the night, transforming their exhibition plan into something bigger. Each piece would now include an artist's statement, telling the story behind the art. They would document everything: the children's growth, the community's involvement, the resistance they'd faced. The next morning, Miss Jenkins found the cafeteria transformed. The walls were covered with children's artwork, each piece accompanied by a powerful personal narrative. Students walked the halls with a new confidence, wearing buttons that read, "Art is truth." She immediately called Principal Matthews, demanding the displays be removed. But as local news crews began arriving, invited by parents to cover the inspiring story of community art and cultural celebration, the administration's position shifted. Suddenly, Principal Matthews was talking about Lincoln Elementary's commitment to diverse artistic expression and community engagement. Angela watched Miss Jenkins storm down the hallway, her carefully maintained composure cracking. The exhibition wasn't just challenging her authority now. It was exposing the gap between the school's professed values and its actual practices. "Mom," Chloe called, waving from her display. "Come see what we added." The children had created a collaborative piece, a massive mural where each student's individual story flowed into a larger narrative of transformation. In the center, painted with careful detail, was a dress covered in flowers growing from paint stains. Looking at her daughter's proud smile, Angela knew the fight was far from over. But something fundamental had shifted. They had moved from asking for acceptance to demanding recognition, from seeking approval to claiming space. Miss Jenkins might still control her classroom, but she no longer controlled the narrative. The morning of the exhibition arrived with an electric energy in the air. Lincoln Elementary's halls buzzed with anticipation as parents and students made final preparations. The cafeteria had been transformed into a professional gallery space, with proper lighting installed by local artists and clean white temporary walls creating intimate viewing areas. Angela arrived early, her heart racing as she watched volunteers positioning the final pieces. Each section told a story: traditional crafts passed down through generations, contemporary interpretations of cultural heritage, and powerful personal narratives about identity and belonging. At the center stood Chloe's installation, her ruined dress, now restored and transformed into an art piece itself, surrounded by paintings that chronicled her journey from shame to empowerment. "They're here," Maria called from the entrance. News vans had begun arriving, setting up cameras in the parking lot. The school board members walked in first, their faces professionally neutral, but their tension visible in tight shoulders and careful steps. Behind them came community leaders, other school administrators, and a steady stream of families from across the district. Miss Jenkins arrived last, standing at the entrance, with an expression caught between disdain and disbelief. Her usual perfectly pressed outfit seemed at odds with her slightly disheveled hair and reddened eyes. She clutched a folder to her chest like a shield. "Welcome to our true colors," Angela announced to the gathered crowd, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "This exhibition represents more than art. It represents our children's voices, their experiences, and their right to be fully themselves in every space they occupy." The audience moved through the exhibition in waves, stopping at each piece to read the accompanying stories. Children proudly guided visitors through their work, their voices growing stronger with each retelling. Parents who had once stayed silent now spoke openly about their experiences, their hopes, their demands for change. At James's daughter Anna's display, visitors gathered to watch her demonstrate traditional Chinese brush painting techniques she'd learned from her grandmother. "Miss Jenkins said this wasn't real art," Anna explained, her brush moving confidently across rice paper. "But this is my heritage, my art, my truth." Maria's son Diego presented a mixed media piece combining elements of Mexican folk art with contemporary street art. "I used to hide my sketchbook," he told the local news reporter. "Now I know my art deserves to be seen." The impact was immediate and visceral. School board members huddled in corners, speaking in urgent whispers. Other teachers from Lincoln Elementary moved through the space, some appearing shocked, others nodding in recognition of truths they'd long ignored. Miss Jenkins attempted to maintain her composure, but her facade cracked when she reached Chloe's installation. The dress hung like an accusation, its paint stains now blooming with embroidered flowers added by community artists. Around it, Chloe's paintings told the story in unflinching detail: the deliberate spill, the mocking laughter, the silence of witnesses. "This is slander," Miss Jenkins hissed, turning to Principal Matthews. "You can't allow this display of what, Miss Jenkins?" Chloe stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Of what actually happened. Of how you made me feel. Of how you make lots of us feel." Other students gathered behind Chloe, a united front of young faces no longer willing to be silenced. Parents moved closer, forming a protective circle around their children. "Art is about truth," Chloe continued, repeating the words she'd heard from visiting artists. "And this is our truth." The local news cameras captured everything: Miss Jenkins's reaction, the student solidarity, the powerful display of community support. Principal Matthews, reading the room, stepped forward with a carefully worded statement about learning opportunities and community dialogue. But the real moment of triumph came later, when Angela overheard two school board members discussing the need for immediate policy changes and cultural sensitivity training. The exhibition had made theoretical problems viscerally real, forcing acknowledgement of issues long ignored. As the day progressed, more visitors arrived through word of mouth. Teachers from other schools came to see what their colleagues were discussing. Community leaders pledged support for ongoing cultural arts programs. What had started as a response to one incident had grown into a movement for systemic change. Miss Jenkins left early. Her folder of complaints never opened, her authority visibly diminished. But her departure barely registered. The exhibition had moved beyond her, beyond single acts of discrimination, into something larger and more transformative. By evening, as they began cleaning up, Angela found Chloe sitting quietly beside her installation. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked, noting her daughter's thoughtful expression. "I'm not afraid anymore," Chloe replied, touching the embroidered flowers on her dress. "And I don't think the other kids are either." Angela looked around at the remaining visitors still engaged in intense discussions, at the news crews packaging their feel-good story about community art that would actually broadcast their message of resistance to a wider audience, at the school officials awkwardly trying to position themselves on the right side of change. The exhibition would end, but its impact would remain, in policy changes, in shifted perspectives, in children who had learned to stand up for their truths. They had transformed a space of exclusion into one of celebration, a moment of shame into a declaration of pride. And they were just getting started. The exhibition's success reverberated through Lincoln Elementary like an earthquake, creating aftershocks that transformed the school's landscape. Local newspapers ran front-page stories about the Community Art Initiative, forcing the administration to publicly address issues they'd long dismissed. The headline "Students Paint Truth. Local School Confronts Discrimination Through Art" spread across social media, drawing attention from education advocates across the state. Angela's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Parents from other schools wanted to know how to organize similar programs. Civil rights organizations offered support and resources. Local politicians, sensing a shift in public opinion, began making statements about educational equity and cultural inclusion. "We need to harness this momentum," Maria said during an emergency meeting of their now formal parent advocacy group. They gathered in the local library's conference room, which was becoming too small for their growing numbers. "But we also need to protect our children from backlash." The backlash had already begun. Miss Jenkins's supporters, a vocal minority of parents and teachers, had started a counter-campaign, writing letters to the school board about maintaining academic standards and avoiding political agendas in education. Their coded language barely masked their resistance to change. Chloe and her classmates felt the tension. Some teachers, taking cues from Miss Jenkins, had become more rigid in their grading, more critical of student expression. But something fundamental had shifted in the children themselves. They'd found their voice, and they weren't willing to lose it again. "My teacher said my essay about the exhibition was too controversial," Diego reported during a student meeting organized by the advocacy group. So, I wrote another one about why it's important to tell our stories. The whole class supported me. The media attention brought unexpected allies. A renowned art therapist reached out, offering to document how the program had impacted students' emotional well-being. University researchers requested permission to study the initiative as a model for cultural integration in education. Each external validation made it harder for the administration to dismiss their concerns. Principal Matthews called Angela to her office, ostensibly to discuss moving forward constructively. The principal sat behind her desk, surrounded by hastily ordered books about diversity and inclusion, their spines still uncracked. "We appreciate the enthusiasm the exhibition has generated," Matthews began carefully. "But we need to ensure these discussions don't disrupt our educational mission. Our educational mission should include making every student feel valued," Angela replied, noting how the principal flinched at her directness. "The disruption isn't coming from our children's truth. It's coming from the system's resistance to hearing it." The meeting ended with vague promises of reform, but Angela knew better than to rely on institutional goodwill. That evening, she and the other parent leaders drafted a comprehensive proposal: mandatory cultural competency training for all staff, revision of art and literature curricula to include diverse perspectives, regular cultural celebrations integrated into the school calendar, and clear accountability measures for discriminatory behavior. "They'll say it's too expensive, too complicated, too soon," James warned as they finalized the document. "Then we'll show them how expensive and complicated discrimination is," Angela responded, thinking of therapy bills, transferred students, potential lawsuits. "We've got the receipts now." The local press continued to follow the story, particularly after other schools began reporting similar issues. What had started as one mother's response to her daughter's humiliation was becoming a regional conversation about systemic change. Chloe flourished in this new environment. She and her friends had started an art club, meeting during lunch to share ideas and support each other's creativity. Their artwork now decorated the school's corridors, not just in designated display areas, but everywhere, making their presence impossible to ignore. "Miss Jenkins doesn't look at us anymore," Chloe told her mother one evening. "She just teaches the lesson and leaves. But we don't need her to see us now. We see each other." The pressure on the administration mounted as more parents came forward with their stories. The school board, facing increasing scrutiny, scheduled a special session to address the concerns raised by the exhibition. They invited Angela and her group to present their proposal. "They're trying to control the narrative," Maria observed. "Make it look like they're taking action." "Then we'll use their platform," Angela replied. "But we'll tell our story, not theirs." The advocacy group worked late into the night, preparing their presentation. They gathered statistics, documented incidents, collected student testimonials. Each piece of evidence built their case. This wasn't about one teacher, one incident, or one school. This was about transforming a system that had failed too many children for too long. As they worked, Angela received a text from another parent. Miss Jenkins had been seen cleaning out her classroom after hours, removing personal items from her desk. The news spread quickly through their network, generating cautious hope and nervous anticipation. "Will she leave?" Chloe asked when Angela told her. "Maybe," Angela answered honestly. "But this isn't just about Miss Jenkins anymore. It's about making sure no teacher can do what she did ever again." The momentum was building, carrying them towards something larger than they'd initially imagined. They'd started by demanding space for their children's art. Now they were demanding space for their children's futures. The school board meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening, but by Tuesday afternoon, the parking lot was already filling with news vans. The story had caught fire on social media after a local education blogger shared surveillance footage of Miss Jenkins removing items from her classroom at midnight, sparking speculation about her future at Lincoln Elementary. Angela and her team gathered early in the school library for final preparations. The expanded parent advocacy group now included representatives from every grade level, each bringing their own documentation of discriminatory incidents that had gone unaddressed. "Remember," Angela instructed as they reviewed their presentation, "we're not here to negotiate. We're here to demand change." James had prepared a detailed financial analysis showing how discrimination cost the district in student transfers, legal liability, and damaged reputation. Maria had compiled testimonials from students and parents, their stories forming a damning pattern of institutional failure. Other parents had researched successful diversity programs in neighboring districts, providing concrete models for reform. Miss Jenkins arrived at the meeting early, taking a seat in the front row. Her usual immaculate appearance had slipped further. Her hair was unkempt, her slightly wrinkled. The folder she clutched seemed thicker than before, stuffed with papers that spilled from its edges. As the room filled, the tension became palpable. District officials sat stiffly at their elevated table, while Principal Matthews hovered uncertainly between them and the crowd. Community members packed the space, many wearing buttons and t-shirts created for the exhibition. This meeting of the Lincoln Elementary School Board will come to order, the board president announced, his voice barely masking his discomfort. We're here to discuss recent concerns about lies. Miss Jenkins suddenly stood, her voice sharp with hysteria. This is all based on lies and exaggeration. I have documentation. Miss Jenkins, the board president warned, please wait your turn. But she was already moving toward the podium, pulling papers from her folder. 23 years of exemplary service. 23 years of maintaining standards. And now these people, she gestured wildly at Angela and the other parents. These people want to destroy everything we've built. Angela watched calmly as Miss Jenkins's careful facade finally shattered completely. The teacher's voice rose as she waved various documents, student grades showing declining standards, news articles about failing schools that abandoned traditional methods, letters from parents praising her firm discipline. Look at what happens when we let them change things, she continued, her words becoming more explicitly racist with each sentence. Look at what happens when we stop maintaining proper standards, proper behavior, proper what, Miss Jenkins? Angela's voice cut through the chaos as she stood. Proper whiteness? Proper submission? Proper silence? The room fell silent. Camera shutters clicked rapidly, capturing Miss Jenkins's expression of naked prejudice and Angela's controlled dignity. Would you like to explain to everyone what proper means to you? Angela continued, moving toward the podium. Would you like to tell these cameras exactly why my daughter's dress was too loud? Why Maria's son's Spanish is too disruptive? Why James's daughter's art is too oriental? Miss Jenkins's face flushed deep red. You're twisting my words. We have it all documented. Angela interrupted, her voice steady. Every incident, every accident, every coded comment, every grade that dropped when a child dared to express their culture. Every time you used your power to make our children smaller, quieter, less themselves. Other parents stood, forming a wall of solidarity behind Angela. Students who had come with their families moved forward too, including Chloe, who stared directly at Miss Jenkins without flinching. This isn't about you anymore, Angela continued. This is about every teacher who thinks like you, every administrator who enables you, every policy that protects you while hurting our children. The board president tried to restore order, but the moment had gained its own momentum. Parents began sharing their stories directly, one after another, their voices growing stronger with each testimony. The cameras swiveled between their passionate speeches and Miss Jenkins's increasingly defensive responses. I demand you stop this immediately, Miss Jenkins finally shouted at the board. Either you support my authority, or I'll have no choice but to what? Angela asked quietly. To resign? To face the consequences of your actions? To finally see yourself as our children have seen you? Miss Jenkins looked around the room, perhaps truly seeing for the first time how isolated she had become. Even her previous supporters sat silently, unwilling to defend her after her mask had slipped so completely. I move that we begin our presentation, Angela addressed the board, turning away from Miss Jenkins. We have a comprehensive plan for reform, and unlike some, we have the documentation to support every point. As Angela moved to set up their presentation, Miss Jenkins gathered her scattered papers with trembling hands and walked toward the exit. She paused at the door, perhaps hoping someone would defend her, call her back, restore her authority. No one did. The days following the school board meeting unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of consequences. Miss Jenkins's public meltdown had gone viral, with clips spreading across social media platforms and news outlets. The district's phones rang constantly with calls from education reporters, civil rights organizations, and concerned citizens from across the state. Principal Matthews found herself facing an internal investigation as more evidence emerged of ignored complaints and buried incident reports. The filing cabinet in her office revealed years of documented discrimination that had been systematically dismissed as minor incidents or misunderstandings. "Look at these dates," Maria said, reviewing copies of complaints they'd finally obtained through official channels. Their parent advocacy group had set up a temporary command center in the community center, with tables covered in documents and laptops displaying spreadsheets of incidents. Some of these go back 5 years. They knew. They all knew. Former students began coming forward, sharing their own experiences with Miss Jenkins and the administration's persistent inaction. A graduate now studying education at the State University wrote a powerful op-ed about how years of subtle discrimination had nearly destroyed her love of art until a college professor helped her reclaim it. "The problem isn't just Miss Jenkins," Angela explained to a panel of education officials who'd been dispatched from the state capitol to assess the situation. "She's a symptom of a system that prioritizes conformity over creativity, compliance over cultural identity, silence over truth." The district superintendent, feeling the pressure of mounting media attention, called an emergency session to address the crisis. Angela and her team arrived prepared, armed with their comprehensive reform proposal and backed by a coalition of civil rights attorneys who'd offered their services pro bono. "We can't just remove one teacher and pretend that solves the problem," Angela insisted during the session. "We need systemic change, with real accountability and meaningful consequences." Miss Jenkins herself had gone silent, but her impact continued to reverberate through the community. Students who transferred out of Lincoln Elementary years earlier contacted the parent advocacy group with their stories. A pattern emerged of targeted discrimination that had driven dozens of families from the school, each departure quietly noted in administrative files as voluntary transfers. Chloe watched these developments with growing confidence. The art club she'd helped establish had become a safe space for students to process their experiences through creativity. Their latest project involved creating a timeline of resistance, documenting not just the incidents of discrimination, but the moments of solidarity and triumph that had emerged from their struggle. "We're teaching them how to fight back with beauty," Angela overheard one of the parent volunteers saying during an art club session. "How to answer hatred with creativity." The pressure for action mounted as local civil rights organizations began conducting their own investigations. They uncovered similar patterns at other schools in the district, suggesting a broader cultural problem that required comprehensive reform. "This isn't just about art class anymore," James observed during a strategy meeting. "We're exposing decades of institutional racism that they can't ignore or explain away." Principal Matthews, sensing the shifting winds, attempted to position herself as an ally in their fight for change. She scheduled meetings with Angela's group, PROME, seeking support for their initiatives, but her previous inaction had permanently damaged her credibility. "Too little, too late," Maria muttered after one such meeting. She had years to address these issues. Now she wants credit for acknowledging what she helped hide. The investigation into Miss Jenkins's conduct expanded to include her entire teaching career. Former colleagues from other schools came forward with stories of similar incidents, painting a picture of long-term systematic discrimination hidden behind a facade of maintaining standards. Angela received a call from the State Board of Education requesting her participation in a task force on cultural sensitivity in schools. The invitation recognized what their movement had become, not just a local response to one incident, but a model for addressing systemic discrimination in education. "They're trying to control the narrative again," Maria warned when Angela shared the news. "Make it look like they're taking the lead on reform. Then we'll use their platform," Angela replied, echoing their earlier strategy. "But we'll keep pushing for real change, not just symbolic gestures." The local press continued to follow the story, But their coverage had shifted from sensational headlines about teacher misconduct to more substantive reporting on educational inequality and institutional reform. Angela's group had succeeded in changing not just policies, but the very conversation around discrimination in schools. Miss Jenkins resigned, Chloe announced one evening, reading the news on her tablet. They say she's leaving the state. Angela sat beside her daughter, noting how differently Chloe carried herself now. Shoulders straight, head high, voice clear. The incident with the dress had left its mark, but not the one Miss Jenkins had intended. Instead of shame, it had sparked determination. Instead of silence, it had inspired action. Is it over now? Chloe asked. Angela thought about the ongoing investigations, the pending policy changes, the deep-rooted prejudices still hiding behind institutional policies and professional facades. No, baby, she answered honestly. But something important has started, and we're going to see it through. The final staff meeting of the school year buzzed with nervous energy. Principal Matthews had announced her early retirement the week before, acknowledging her role in perpetuating a system that had failed too many students. The school board, under continued public scrutiny, had conducted a nationwide search for new leadership, prioritizing candidates with strong records in cultural competency and inclusive education. Dr. Sarah Chun stood at the front of the library, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. As Lincoln Elementary's new principal, she had already begun implementing changes before officially taking office. Our first priority, she announced to the assembled staff, is rebuilding trust with our community. Not through empty promises, but through concrete actions and measurable results. Angela sat in the back, now serving on the school's newly established Diversity and Inclusion Committee. The past few months had transformed Lincoln Elementary. The art room, once Miss Jenkins's domain of rigid conformity, had been reimagined as a collaborative space under the guidance of Mr. Rodriguez, a dynamic young teacher whose portfolio included community art projects and cultural education initiatives. "Mom, look," Chloe called out after her first class with Mr. Rodriguez. She held up a painting that incorporated traditional African patterns she'd been researching with her grandmother. He said, "My culture isn't just something to celebrate during Heritage Month. It's part of who I am as an artist." The school's transformation extended beyond the art program. New curriculum guidelines emphasize cultural literacy across all subjects. Teacher training now included regular workshops on recognizing and addressing bias. The parent advocacy group had evolved into a permanent advisory board, ensuring that community voices remained central to school policy. "Remember when we just wanted them to acknowledge what happened to your dress?" Maria asked during one of their regular coffee meetings. "Now look at us, changing entire educational policies." The dress itself had found a permanent home in a display case near the school entrance, surrounded by student artwork and stories of transformation. A plaque beneath it read, "From silence to strength, our journey toward justice." Next to it hung a growing collection of photographs documenting the school's ongoing evolution. Dr. Chun had made it her mission to transform Lincoln Elementary into a model for inclusive education. She worked closely with Angela's group, understanding that real change required continuous community involvement. "We're not just changing rules," she explained during a district-wide educational conference where Lincoln's transformation had become a case study. "We're changing culture. That takes time, commitment, and most importantly, partnership with our families." The impact rippled beyond Lincoln Elementary. Other schools in the district began implementing similar programs, often consulting with Angela's group for guidance. The State Board of Education used their experience to develop new guidelines for cultural competency in schools. Miss Jenkins's departure had made national news, but it was the changes that followed that kept media attention focused on Lincoln Elementary. Education journalists regularly visited to document their progress, interviewing students, teachers, and parents about the school's transformation. "Tell me about the difference you've seen," one reporter asked Chloe during a follow-up story. "I used to think I had to choose," Chloe answered, her voice confident and clear, "between being myself and being accepted. Now I know that real acceptance means being celebrated for who you are." On the last day of school, Angela walked through Lincoln Elementary's halls, noting how differently the space felt. Student artwork filled every available surface, each piece accompanied by personal statements about identity, culture, and belonging. The sound of children's laughter echoed through corridors that had once felt constrained by unspoken rules and hidden prejudices. In the art room, Mr. Rodriguez was helping students set up for an end-of-year showcase. Their projects reflected a diversity of influences, techniques, and perspectives that would have been unimaginable under Miss Jenkins's reign. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, gesturing to a particular display. "You should see this." The sixth grade class had created a collaborative piece titled, "The Future We Create." In its center, painted with remarkable detail, was an image of a paint-stained dress transformed into a garden of possibilities. Around it, students had added their own symbols of change, broken barriers, open doors, bridges between communities. "I think," Mr. Rodriguez said quietly, "this is just the beginning." Angela touched the frame of the artwork, remembering the fear and anger that had driven her to speak up months ago. That moment of crisis had sparked a movement, but it was the daily work of students, teachers, and parents that had turned that spark into lasting change. Dr. Chin joined them, carrying a stack of next year's curriculum plans. "We've come far," she said, "but there's still so much to do." Angela nodded, watching Chloe explain her latest project to a group of younger students. Her daughter moved with confidence now, her voice strong, her creativity unleashed. The paint stains that had once marked her shame had become badges of courage, reminders that sometimes the deepest wounds could inspire the most powerful healing. "Yes," Angela agreed, "there's always more to do. But now we know how to do it together."